Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. For as little as $2 a month, so less than a cup of coffee, you can help us pay our producers and our social media editor and basically keep the podcast going.
If you contribute to Always Take Notes on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, notably a sheaf of successful magazine pitches from myself and Rachel and former co-hosts and friends of the show, which is really useful for any aspiring writer.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke to journalist and provocateur Toby Young.
We spoke to Toby about his short-lived career at the Times, his ill-fated spell at Vanity Fair, and his long-standing career as a contrarian and pundit.
It's a fascinating episode. We hope you enjoy it.
So, Toby, great to have you on Always Take Notes. Thanks for finding the time. We're doing this via video call due to the lockdown. We were wondering if we could start with your initial desire to become a journalist and some of your early experiences in the 1990s at the Modern Review and so forth. What was the initial attraction to becoming a journalist from your side?
Well, I remember being at my mother's book party. So my mother wrote a couple of novels, and when I was a teenager, I think she had the party for her second novel, and there were various journalists there. She knew various journalists, and she also worked as a journalist herself. And I remember one of the journalists there telling me, that it was better than working for a living. And it occurred, I sort of had this vision, I think, of being able to sort of stand on a soapbox, as my mother had just done, and speak and have people listen. And, as a precocious, attention-seeking teenager, that was very attractive in its own right. But the idea of getting paid for doing that seemed very appealing. And I liked the company of journalists, and I liked the fact that they seemed slightly unrespectable and had a kind of, honor amongst thieves spirit. And there was a kind of, ne'er-do-wells all hanging out together, kind of throwing rocks, throwing stones at the windows of more respectable people. All that very much appealed to me as a teenager. So I sort of decided, I think, around then when I was 14, 15, that if possible, I'd like to be a journalist.
And were there any forays into student journalism?
Yes. I started a magazine at the sixth form of William Ellis, I was in the last grammar school year. It's now a comprehensive in North London. There was only one issue, and it was a rival to the much more respectable official sixth form magazine. And then when I went to Oxford, various magazines I discovered were named after rivers, so Isis, Cherwell, etc., Tributary. And so I thought, bigger river, bigger magazine. So I started a magazine called the Danube. But my brilliant wheeze was to change the name of each issue. So each issue would be named after another river. And the Danube was about Britain's relationship with Central Europe. And the next one was called the Hudson. And that was about Britain's relationship with America. And it never went beyond issue 2. And I ended up editing Tributary, which was the Oxford equivalent of Private Eye. And it actually had the people who passed it on to me, more or less, were Andrew Sullivan and Neil Ferguson, who were a year or two above me. And after I'd edited Tributary, I then passed it on to Boris Johnson and Darius Guppy, who jointly edited it. So it had a fairly distinguished lineage. I'm not sure if it still exists.
What was your immediate postgraduate path into journalism? How did you go about making your way at that time?
I started writing for the National Press when I was still a student. So I wrote a piece for New Society, a magazine that no longer exists. It became part of the New Statesman. That was in 1985, I think, and it was a piece about youth culture. And as a consequence of that, I was contacted by an editor at The Observer, and I ended up signing a contract with The Observer to write sort of, 15 features a year while I was still a student. And then when I left, I got a job as a news trainee at The Times. And I lasted at The Times for 6 months. The reason I didn't last longer than that is because every morning when I came into work, I would try and log on to the internal computer system as the editor-in-chief. The editor-in-chief was this plain-spoken Scotsman called Charles Wilson. And I tried different passwords, just almost as a way of doodling before getting down to work each morning. And eventually, after 6 months, I hit the right one, which was Top Man. And when you sent a message to someone from the within the internal computer system, the person who the message was from would come up underneath in big bold letters. So I immediately sent a message to my boss, who was this rather languid, supercilious, middle-aged man with long flowing locks who drove an open-top MG. And my message said, "Move your effing car. It's in my space." Signed The Editor. And he kind of leapt up as if struck with a cattle prod and ran into the car park and moved his car. And I thought, I can have some fun here. And I sort of wreaked havoc, masquerading as the editor for about a week. And then the sort of IT police, the internal IT police, tracked down the miscreant. And I was summoned to the managing editor's office. And I thought, well, I'll get a slap on the wrist, but secretly he'll be quite impressed because, after all, being able to kind of guess passwords and hack computer systems is an essential skill if you want to be a journalist, these days. Instead, I was greeted by a security guard and handed the contents of my office drawer in a kind of clear plastic bag and escorted from the premises. So that was the end of my career as a news trainee at the Times.
And what was the, looking back, what was the kind of motivation to do that, to engage in this thing, which was quite elaborate and pretty thought through, but did terminate your employment there? What do you think was driving you to do that?
I think I've always had a problem with authority. I can't. I find it very difficult to toe the line, to behave well, to obey the rules. I've always had a kind of strong, rebellious, anti-authoritarian streak, and it has quite often got me into trouble. Curiously, I suppose I don't think ahead of time that it's likely to get me into as much trouble as it generally does, and it's taken a long time to learn that lesson. But I think it must have something to do with that.
When you were at the Times, what were the sort of things that you were doing other than hacking the editor-in-chief's account?
Well, I think the first thing I did I think it could even have been the first day I got there, I was told to, I think Peterborough had been anointed in some poll as the most normal town in Britain. So I was dispatched at sort of 10 a.m. to go to Peterborough, interview some normal residents, find out a bit about the town, and file a colour piece by 3:30 p.m. that day. So off I went to Peterborough on the train and sort of didn't know how to do this, but it was very much being plunged in at the deep end. I worked at one point, my job was interviewing portfolio winners. Portfolio was the Times's upmarket version of bingo. And I remember one of the things we had to put in the paper each day when we interviewed the previous day's portfolio winner, we had to put a brief description of the winner, which included their age. And quite often I would find myself ringing up the these women in late middle age and working up to asking them how old they were, which they were very reluctant to disclose. It was, it was a sort of variety of things. You would try it out in, you spent some time in different departments. The idea was to kind of get a broad experience of what it was like working for a national newspaper. I remember not being terribly impressed with the kind of day-to-day operation of the Times. Most of the journalists were, fairly subdued and seemed a bit bored. But when there was a national disaster, I can't remember exactly what happened. There was some rail accident or something. Suddenly, the entire place came to life in a way which was amazing to behold. Everyone was suddenly kind of at the top of their game, really excited, kind of running on adrenaline, doing amazing work to kind of get as much information about the disaster in the following day's paper. And that gave me a glimpse of the excitement of journalism, which is, particularly if you're working for a daily newspaper or a news organization, the day-to-day life can be pretty quotidian and dull. But sometimes when there's a big breaking story, it just becomes incredibly exciting and dramatic. And it's kind of that kind of, even though my experience at the Times wasn't generally good, seeing the newsroom really spring to life that day did make me think that it was a profession I wanted to be in.
And when, with other people of kind of similar age to yourself, we've asked them, looking back, on journalism at that period, it's easy, given what's happened with the inroads the internet has made into the business model and everything like that, to see it through rose-tinted spectacles. This was sort of late 1980s, I suppose, but what, in retrospect, was your view of what was good about that period of journalism and what maybe in retrospect was less good?
It was quite a good period to be a journalist. It was very different to today. A good time to be starting out because there was an explosion of entrepreneurial activity in the print journalism space, partly as a result of Rupert Murdoch's defiance of the print unions and whopping. And I remember being asked when I first applied for a job as a news trainee at the Times by the editor, by the deputy editor at the time, whether I would have any qualms about crossing a picket line, because at that time, when I started there in '86, there was, you had to literally cross a picket line in order to enter News International's whopping plant. But because of that, it became much cheaper to print newspapers, and as a consequence, a number of newspapers were started. So there was Eddie Shah's Today. There was a new evening paper, a rival to the Evening Standard. The Independent. I can't remember when that started. I think it was just before I started at the Times. But, it was an explosion of newsprint and seemed like a kind of really great time to be starting out as a journalist. It seemed like there were going to be all these great opportunities. And I remember being offered different jobs. I was offered a job on the new London evening paper, but ended up taking the job at the Times. But, very different to today.
And so what did you do after you were sacked from the Times?
I freelanced for about 6 months, mainly working for the Mail on Sunday's You magazine. And then I applied for a Fulbright scholarship to go to Harvard, and went to Harvard for a year between '87 and '88. And that convinced me that I should pursue an academic career. And I quite convinced, but anyway, I decided to see if I could pursue an academic career. And so I applied to do a PhD at Cambridge. And so when I came back from Harvard, I went to Trinity College, Cambridge, and embarked on a PhD in philosophy. And I did that for 2 years and decided that actually a life in the ivory tower wasn't something I was cut out for. And so went back to journalism in sort of around 89, 90.
And could you tell us about the Modern Review then? How did that come about, and what direction did that take your career in?
So I had got to know Julie Burchill when I was still a student, because the person who lived next door to me but one in Islington was Cosmo Landesman. And round about 84, I think, Julie left her first husband, Tony Parsons, and moved in with Cosmo. So literally became the girl next door. And she at that time had a burgeoning career in journalism, and encouraged me to become a journalist as well. And at one stage, I remember she was offered a column by Time Out and didn't think she'd have time to write it, a weekly column. And I said, no, take it and I'll write the column for you and you can just present it as written by you and we can split the money. And we did that for a bit. And actually in one of her greatest hits collections, some of my pieces, which had appeared under her byline in Time Out, appeared under her name. Some of the better ones, I have to say. And we kind of fantasized, me, Julie and Cosmo, about starting our own magazine. And we were sort of in love with the kind of romance of the world of little magazines, which was a thing then, not really a thing anymore. I mean, I guess the equivalent is online magazines now. And we talked about it a lot. And when I left Cambridge, I talked to them more seriously about it and said, look, why don't we try and do it? Why don't we actually set up a magazine? And we were all fascinated by popular culture, and we all disliked the way in which mass culture was covered in the broadsheets and by a lot of the more respectable broadcasters, which was a sort of slightly sneering, contemptuous way. Not exclusively, but for the most part. And genre fiction was looked down upon. Action films were generally kind of viewed with disdain. No one took mass culture as seriously as our generation seemed to at that time. And it seemed like there was, the time was ripe for a different approach to critically evaluating popular culture, doing it in a much more serious-minded way. And so that was the idea for the Modern Review. We called it Low Culture for Highbrows. And the format was the same as the TLS, the London Review of Books. And the idea was that we wanted to produce pieces of a similar intellectual caliber by intellectuals and academics, but instead of being about, the latest biography of Anthony Trollope, it would be about, Madonna and Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think Julie described it as smash hits edited by F.R. Leavis. And I created a dummy, and on the basis of that, kind of managed to raise a bit of money from backers and persuade some advertisers to come in. And we launched the first issue, I think, in September of 1991. And initially it was a quarterly, but it quite quickly became a bi-monthly. And at its peak, after a couple of years, it was doing very well and selling about 25,000 copies, not just in the UK, but internationally, particularly in the US. And this was in the pre-internet era. So these were all, either subscriptions or newsstand sales. And it was all produced out of my bedsit in Shepherd's Bush. And I had fantasies, as I was laying it out on the kind of kitchen table, that this was the beginning of a media empire. Jan Wenner, the creator of Rolling Stone, started it in his kitchen and laid it out on his kitchen table, and then transformed it into a multi-million pound media empire, and ended up, I think, having his own private jet at one stage. So I had fantasies that, of parlaying these early inauspicious beginnings into a kind of global media brand. But I ended up falling out with Julie in 1995 when she left Cosmo and ran off with Charlotte Raven, who was then an associate editor on the magazine and wanted to depose me and make Charlotte the editor. So in secret, I produced a final issue of the Modern Review and published it, announcing that I'd shut it down because I'd fallen out with Julie. And eventually it was resurrected under Charlotte, but didn't last very long.
And from there, how did you come to work at Vanity Fair?
So when the Modern Review went belly up in 95, I had already done a couple of pieces for Vanity Fair. I met Graydon Carter, then the editor-in-chief, at a Sunday Times magazine lunch hosted by Andrew Neil, I think in 93. And I remember pitching him this idea at this lunch of a sort of photo story, which would be Britain's most celebrated authors in their favourite pubs, you know, headshots of people like Martin Amis and Ian McEwan in their favourite boozers nursing pints. And Graydon looked at me and he said, "What, are you fucking kidding? It would look like a dental catalogue." And that was his sort of general kind of demeanour. He was full of kind of cynical, wisecracking New York humour. Anyway, we got on very well, and he commissioned me to do a couple of things. And then when the Modern Review went belly up in 95, he said, "Why don't you come out to New York, spend some time at Vanity Fair?" I think his idea was that I would start a similar magazine to the Modern Review, but in New York. I think he saw in me a fellow magazine entrepreneur. He himself, with Kurt Anderson,
with Spy, right? Yeah,
had started Spy, yeah. In the mid '80s, and that had been a big success. And I think he hoped that I would start a similar magazine in New York, and that he would be my mentor. And so off I went to New York, and initially I think the idea was I'd work for Vanity Fair for a month, and that became 3 months, and then 6 months, and ended up working there for 2.5 years, I think. But it was so comfortable being at Vanity Fair. It was so, it was like, I think we used to describe it as a velvet coffin. You didn't actually do very much, but you had this kind of extraordinary expense account. You had kind of limos to take you wherever you wanted to go, because you worked for Vanity Fair, which at that time was, you know, this fantastically glamorous publication. And in those days, you know, glossy magazines were kind of somewhere near the top of the kind of media hierarchy. So you had the kind of keys to the city in your hand. And, you know, I had a high old time for 2.5 years, kind of tearing around New York as a single man, with a decent expense account and a decent salary, without ever producing much for the magazine, and without sort of ever really thinking about starting another magazine and striking out on my own. It was just far too comfortable being at Vanity Fair. But, you know, I messed up in dozens of different ways and ended up falling out with Graydon. And eventually I wrote a book about that experience called How to Lose Friends and Alienate People.
And at what stage was Graydon at when you were there in his journey from, as you say, kind of outsider with Spy magazine throwing stones at the establishment to very much kind of eminence grise of the New York media establishment? Where was he on that journey at that time?
Yeah, I think he still had a mischievous streak when I first started working for him in New York. But you could very much tell that he was on a journey, and from, you know, poacher to gamekeeper. And as he became kind of more and more in love with the American establishment, particularly Hollywood. I think is in part because of the extraordinary leverage given to him by the Vanity Fair Oscar party, which everyone in Hollywood wanted to go to. And I think he hoped to parlay that into a producing career. And he did produce a couple of things, including the kid stays in the picture. And I think he hoped to kind of open up various restaurants as well, and become a kind of player in the world that he had hitherto only chronicled as a magazine editor. That worked out pretty well for him, and he had a very successful career as the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair. I think he retired a couple of years ago. But Vanity Fair gradually became less and less cheeky and mischievous, and threw fewer and fewer stones at the windows of the establishment pangendrums, and eventually became the kind of in-house magazine of the kind of plutocratic elite. One change that hadn't happened when I was still at Vanity Fair was that Graydon hadn't discovered politics. I think he discovered kind of mainstream liberal politics around about 98, 99. And I remember this being explained to me by one of his contacts in Hollywood, who was kind of opening doors for him on the West Coast, that Graydon had realized that at kind of West Coast dinner parties with the kind of Hollywood elite, he was fed up being asked to relay gossip about the latest Vanity Fair cover story, or about which celebrity was shagging which celebrity. It was as though, he'd been consigned to, the socialite kind of division when he wanted to be in the kind of players division. So by kind of discovering politics, he then had something else to talk about at these dinner parties, which kind of enhanced his credibility and made him a more serious player. But I never, and he'd been a long-standing critic of Trump's, but it started out in a kind of amusing kind of piss-taking way, talking about him being a short-fingered vulgarian and whatnot, and kind of eventually kind of morphed into a fairly standard knee-jerk liberal critique of Trump's presidency. I was never persuaded by his politics, but it never really worked out in terms of securing him a Hollywood career either. And I don't quite know where he is now politically.
You mentioned not writing very much when you're at Vanity Fair. Your Wikipedia page says you wrote 3,000 words and earned $85,000. Is that fair? And what did you write about? What did you spend those 3,000 words on?
Yeah, I actually, for the first time in about a year, looked at my Wikipedia page a couple of days ago and saw the line you've just quoted, and it's really annoying because someone on Wikipedia has sliced off the punchline from that line, which was that if you divide the amount I got paid by the number of words I wrote, I'm the highest paid writer that's ever been employed by Vanity Fair on a dollar per word basis. But typically, Wikipedia has chopped off the punchline and just left the setup for the gag. I don't think that's actually true. I'm sure there are much better paid people than me who've been employed by Vanity Fair, such as Dominic Dunn, who really was paid a king's ransom to cover the OJ trial. What did I do for Vanity Fair? I think I did a piece when I first arrived in '85, comparing the internet to CB radio.
Surely 95, not 85.
Sorry, to 95. Yeah. Not one of my most prescient pieces. I wrote a couple of. There was in one of the sections in Vanity Fair towards the front of the book, we wrote about kind of up and coming starlets, and internally in the office, this was known as bimbos on the horizon. And I did a couple of bimbos on the horizon pieces. I think the grand total of my wordage was around 3,000. So not impressive. I think Graydon got it into his head that as a British person, I wasn't a diligent reporter, and I wrote this piece about. I wrote this piece before I started working there full time, about Salman Rushdie and about the life he was living under police protection. This was during this was after the fatwa had been issued, shortly afterwards. And I wrote some funny stories, relayed some funny gossipy stories about dinner parties. And I think there was one story about Zoe Heller sleeping with one of Salman Rushdie's close protection officers at some dinner party that went on all night. And it was a slightly kind of piss-taking piece about the kind of the clash between, literary London and the Metropolitan Police, the close protection officers who were guarding Rushdie. And Hitchens, who was a great friend of Rushdie's, and a great champion of Rushdie's, took real exception to this piece and constantly kind of needled Graydon about it and complained that I'd got all sorts of facts wrong, and sort of waged a campaign to get the fact-checking department to kind of print a correction. And I think partly because of that, Hitch did succeed in destroying my credibility in Graydon's eyes as a reporter. So it became very difficult to persuade Graydon after that to commission me to do anything, even though actually I always disputed Hitch's claims and produced various sources to show that actually the stories I'd relayed in this piece were accurate.
And could you talk us then, in kind of brief about, post America to what you're doing today? How has that journey in terms of the type of work you're doing and things like that, and then bringing in these other projects with the schools and also the Free Speech Union? What's been the kind of thread running through those things, do you think?
Well, after I returned to London in 2000, I wrote up an account of my disastrous career as a Vanity Fair editor, and about my misadventures in New York, called How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. And it was initially rejected by a couple of dozen publishers. Eventually found one willing to publish it, and it became an unlikely bestseller in the UK and then a bestseller internationally. Graydon initially was quite sympathetic to the book and offered to throw a book party for me in New York. But after it became much more successful than he'd anticipated, and he kept being asked about it at parties because it contained a pretty vivid portrait of him, he then soured on it and described it as an unauthorized biography. So I eventually completely fell out with him over the book. After it became a bestseller, I then sold the movie rights, and it was eventually turned into a film, which I think was released in 2008, starring Simon Pegg as me. The film was okay. It wasn't as good as the book. I realized in retrospect that I'd gone for the money and sold it to a producer who persuaded me that it could be a big commercial success, and he was able to raise the money to give it a shot at big commercial success, and it was going to be this big international romantic comedy. I had the dollar signs dancing in my eyes, and also he was it was a guy called Stephen Woolley and his wife Elizabeth Carlson, and they were very nice, and actually I didn't have a bad experience with them at all. We had a great experience. But I think in retrospect, it was a mistake to try and turn it into a big commercial success. We should have actually tried to do it in a much smaller way and kept faith with the spirit of the book. In the end, in the book, even though I'm the sort of anti-hero, it's a very kind of waspish, acidic, caustic picture of New York in the 90s, and ultimately you end up kind of sympathizing with the kind of anti-hero, at least I hope you do, and sort of sharing his disdain and contempt for this kind of plutocratic, dystopia. But the tone of the film is very different. You end up kind of you're supposed to sympathise with the kind of plutocrats and think that the central character is essentially a bit of an idiot who's eventually redeemed when he, through the love of a good woman, and comes around to the values that he's initially rejected. So I thought a much more kind of actually we should, instead of trying to tone down the anti-Americanism of the book to turn it into a commercial success, we should have not worried about it being a commercial success and ratcheted up the volume on its kind of anti-American, kind of cynical, caustic tone. And I think ultimately that would have been a much better film, possibly even a more commercially successful film. Anyway, so that was the book. In 2009, I co-authored and co-produced a drama doc for Channel 4 called When Boris Met Dave, about the kind of rivalry between Dave Cameron and Boris Johnson, which was fun, shown on Channel 4. And then I got married. The reason I came back from New York is in part because I fell in love and got engaged and ended up with 4 kids, all born pretty closely together. So in around 2009, started to worry about where they'd all go to school. The local state schools, the primaries were pretty good where I live. The secondaries, not so good. There were some good ones, or there are some good ones, but you had to be either C of E or Catholic or live virtually in the school to get into them. So anyway, I was starting to worry about where we'd send the kids to school. And at that time, Michael Gove was the Shadow Education Secretary and was talking about free schools and making it possible for charities and groups of parents to set up schools. So I wrote a piece in the Observer in August 2009 saying that I wanted to start one of England's first free schools. And I said I wanted to be a comprehensive grammar school with a comprehensive intake, but grammar school standards, a GROMP. In that piece at the end, I included an email address and said, if you're interested in helping out, contact me and let's see if we can do this. And about 150 people contacted me. I invited them all to a meeting at my house. About 50 people crowded into my sitting room. And out of that group, a steering committee of about 12 people emerged, most of whom I'd never met before. Just they contacted me out of the blue after I'd written this piece. But they were mainly local parents, also worried about whether we were going to send their kids to school. We embarked on this kind of odyssey to try and open a school. And, we had different skills, but none of us had done anything like this before. And it was a very steep learning curve for me, but quite an exciting one too. We became the first group to sign a funding agreement with Michael Gove, and one of the first to open a free school in 2 years later. I was
wondering, with these, you have on the one hand this sort of school project you're doing here, and on the other your kind of business as a columnist and writing provocative stuff there. And I wondered whether, you've written about your dad and how he had this, he was a sort of huge, coined the word meritocracy, had this huge role as a sort of public intellectual and things like that. Do you think that these kind of, as you mentioned earlier, your real distrust of authority, but then also this kind of doing this sort of educational entrepreneurship, do you feel your father's legacy was kind of a factor in those two things?
Yeah, I think that my father was had a lifelong interest in education, but I do think that my father was a positive role model in that he started over the course of his life about 50 institutions, some of which were more successful than others. But one of the most successful that he was involved in starting was the Open University, which in spite of recent problems, I think is still the single largest higher education institution in Europe. And has, I think, at any one time over 250,000 students. And I did think when sitting down and weighing up whether to try and set up a free school, on the one hand, this seemed like an awful lot to take on. who was I to think that I could set up a school? This was clearly a kind of fantastically complicated project involving, battles on a range of different fronts and skill sets that I didn't have, and I hadn't had any experience of leading a project on that scale, a sort of multi-million-pound project like that before. But I guess the fact that my father had started all these institutions, and in particular a university, made me think, well, how hard can it be? I guess that's probably you have to, when you embark on something like that, you have to have a kind of confidence, and I probably got that from my dad too, even though he wasn't socially a very confident man, and could be quite awkward and shy, the cocktail party certainly wasn't his milieu. He had a kind of core, an inner core of steely self-confidence. He believed in his own ability to create organizations, and believed that they'd be successful, and had a number of skills which enabled him to do that, mainly kind of stamina, persistence, bloody-mindedness, a certain amount of charm, and I guess one of the things that enabled my father to start all the institutions he did is that if you have this kind of inner core of certainty, bordering on fanaticism, others will follow you. If you don't admit, you can be, I think part of being a good leader is you listen to people up to a point, you take their criticisms on board, you adjust course if necessary in response to their criticisms, but at some basic level, you don't doubt yourself. You have this kind of fanatical core of self-belief, and if you have that, people will follow you. And my father had that, and I think I have that too, and that's partly why I was able to successfully carry out this incredibly complicated, ambitious project.
Is that what's also got you into trouble, that self-belief that people will follow you if you put yourself out there?
Yeah, it does get you into trouble too. It can come off as the kind of Dunning-Kruger effect. People think sometimes you come off like a kind of delusional contestant on The Apprentice, kind of believing you can kind of start a business overnight and make it successful. And certainly not everything I've tried my hand at has been a success. One thing I left out in the brief kind of canter through my career history is in 2004, there were various sex scandals that beset the Spectator. Rod Liddell left his then wife on their honeymoon and returned to London to run off with the Spectator's receptionist. Boris, who was then the editor, turned out was having an affair with the deputy editor, Petronella Wyatt, even though he initially dismissed this rumour as an inverted pyramid of piffle. And Kimberly Fortier, then the publisher of the magazine, turned out she was having an affair with the blind Home Secretary, David Blunkett. I was sharing the theatre critic beat at the time with a guy called Lloyd Evans, and he still does it actually. And we decided that somebody was bound to write a sex farce set in the Spectator's offices, and it would become this kind of massive West End hit, and we'd kick ourselves for not doing it. So we decided to have a crack at it ourselves. And we wrote a sex farce called Who's the Daddy? And it was put on above this. It was put on at the back of this pub in Islington called the King's Head, not far from where I lived, and not far from where Boris lived. And it was a huge success insofar as, you know, a pub show can be a success. It sold out almost overnight. It got 4-star reviews in most of the broadsheets. And we had 3 offers to take it into the West End. But Boris, who'd been very good, up until this point, he'd been extremely good about the whole thing. He'd taken it on the chin. Remember, on opening night, he sent Lloyd and I a postcard which said, "I always knew my life would be turned into a farce, and I'm just glad it's been entrusted to 2 such distinguished men of letters." And, you know, if he could have used a typeface called irony, he would have done. But that was the extent of his criticism of us. He'd really been very sporting about the whole thing, hadn't fired us, hadn't tried to dissuade us from putting it on, even though, you know, it was ripping the piss out of him in virtually every scene. I remember in the opening scene, there was a kind of huge portrait of Margaret Thatcher behind
Did he stop it going to the West End then?
But he did balk at the West End transfer, yeah, and he didn't threaten me or Lloyd with the sack, but he just tried to appeal to our better nature and essentially said that, you know, you've achieved what you wanted to achieve. You've established your bona fides as playwrights. You can now get another play put on. Why take this one into the West End? You'll only be doing it to, you know, line your pockets, and you'll be doing that at my expense. I've been very good about this until now. We've been friends for 20, 25 years, you know, doesn't that mean anything, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, we decided not to take it into the West End.
Could we talk then
sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say that we then did go on to write a second play called A Right Royal Farce, which wasn't nearly as good as Who's the Daddy? And through sheer bloody-minded persistence, I managed to get that play produced at the King's Head, and that was an absolute disaster. Any reputation enhancement that had taken place as a result of Who's the Daddy was negated and then some by the appalling reception received by A Right Royal Farce. So being persistent and bloody-minded isn't always a kind of killer strategy.
And talking on that note, this idea of, you know, coming back to your column writing, people sometimes talk today about how there's a kind of business of outrage, of people who, you know, there's a market in provocative content. It leads to clicks and advertising and stuff like that. And would you feel that you're operating within that, or do you feel you're outside that? And could you discuss some of your work on free speech as well, on those points too?
Yeah, I think I've always enjoyed taking up difficult positions and trying to defend them. That's sort of intellectually more interesting generally than trying to defend the conventional wisdom. I don't think, I mean, I wouldn't, I don't think that, I mean, I think that the kind of journalism I used to do before I got involved in education and free schools was more of that nature. I guess sort of, I liked kind of, you know, muckraking, iconoclastic journalism and writing provocative opinion pieces. But I became, I think, more serious as a result of my involvement in setting up schools. Ended up co-founding 4 of them. That kind of made me politically more serious. Until then, I'd been fairly cynical about politicians generally, and not particularly sympathetic to any government. But because the free schools policy was a conservative policy, and because the defence of the school was sort of, and the welfare of the school and the future of the school was kind of intimately bound up with the future of the Conservative government that had made it possible, that turned me into a conservative loyalist. And I wouldn't say I'm slavishly loyal. For instance, I've just written something very critical of the current government's approach to managing the coronavirus crisis. But generally, ever since 2010 or so, I'd say, I've been a defender of the Conservative Party and of successive Conservative prime ministers.
How long will you spend on a column typically? And is there a kind of rigorous fact check system in place at the Spectator?
Well, I remember at one stage, me and Matthew Norman were the most prolific columnists in Britain. Someone wrote a piece about it in the Evening Standard. I think we each had 5 columns per week. And when you're doing, a column a day, then you get into the habit of writing them fairly quickly. I think in the past that may have been harder because, as you say, how would you go about fact checking a column that you have to produce daily? But with the internet, that obviously becomes a lot easier. When I was at my kind of column writing peak, I mean, I remember, I could, and sometimes I was, out and about, talking to people, going to see things, trying my hand at different kind of crazy things like working as a greeter in Asda and whatnot. And so often I had to kind of write a column on the move. And I remember being in a radio studio once and in between interviews, dashing off a column in about 20 minutes. But generally speaking, now that I'm down to, 1 or 2 columns a week, I usually spend, about 3.5, 4 hours writing a column, depending on, how intellectually ambitious I'm being, how difficult the subject matter is, how little or how much I know about it, etc.
You mentioned finances as being an impetus for the Free Schools Project. It's one of the rules of the podcast that we always ask people about money. Would you mind laying out in terms of specific or as vague as you like what the balance of your income is from columns, from other projects, from, I know you have a podcast, from books, from all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think it changes. It changes from year to year. I guess I was slightly the percentage of my income that journalism contributes to started to decline towards the as I got more and more involved in education. I was at one stage the chairman of the board of trustees of the multi-academy trust that the 4 schools I helped sit within, and then I became the CEO of that multi-academy trust, and then that contributed, I don't know, about 40% of my income when I was doing that, and then I became the director of the New Schools Network in around about late 2016. I think I was acting director in late 2016 and became the full-time director in 2017. And that that constituted, I don't know, about 60% of my income. And so I was gradually moving towards away from journalism and towards a role in public education. But that all came to a grinding halt at the beginning of 2018 when I was appointed to the board of the Office for Students. That wasn't a paid job, incidentally, but it was a public position, and that caused a big fuss. I got cancelled, had to stand down from that job, and ended up having to stand down from 4 other positions too.
And sorry to interrupt. We're coming up against our limit, and Rachel's got a time limit. Rachel's got a meeting she has to get to in a few minutes. But just as a final point, could you talk about, from that, how you became involved in this campaigning on freedom of speech? And I suppose the criticism that is often raised at that is that people use, ideas of freedom of speech to defend hate speech or things like that. Could you maybe just, and we've only got a couple of minutes here, but talk about, what your organization is there and what your response would be to where you draw the lines of what is permissible in speech and in writing.
Sorry, just to finish the last point, Simon,
Yeah.
I was just going to say that since the beginning of 2018, almost all my income has gone back to being journalism because I'm no longer involved in any public education roles. It was the experience, I think, of being brutally cancelled at the beginning of 2018 that prompted me in part to want to set up the Free Speech Union, because when you're going through something like that, it's not clear who to turn to for good advice. You want kind of good, reliable, objective legal advice, PR advice, career advice. You want to know, should I apologize? What should I say in my apology? Will that draw a line under it? And so on and so forth. You're in kind of completely uncharted territory. No one wants to go near you because you become a pariah. And it's a kind of lonely and isolating position to be in. And I wanted to start an organization that someone who finds themselves in that position could rely on for good advice, as well as psychological support. And that was the impetus behind the Free Speech Union, which launched in February, now has approaching 3,000 members, including lots of impressive people on the Legal Advisory Council, the Media and PR Advisory Council, and the General Advisory Council. Got some great directors, Professor Nigel Bigger, Douglas Murray. On the hate speech question, inevitably there've been some brickbats thrown at the Free Speech Union, people claiming that it's just to protect male, pale and stale conservatives from having to suffer the consequences of spewing bile. I think that's a very short-sighted and wrong-headed view. I think that if you look at the history of minority rights movements like the civil rights movement in America, the gay rights movement, they have been completely reliant on the protection of the First Amendment. Without free speech, we wouldn't have seen the rights of minorities and historically disadvantaged groups being enfranchised in the way that they have over the past 50 years. So I don't see this conflict between kind of diversity on the one hand and viewpoint diversity on the other. I see them absolutely going hand in hand. And I think it's very short-sighted of people on the left to having won various battles by taking advantage of things like the First Amendment to now turn their back on free speech and say, let's impose speech restrictions on our ideological enemies now that we have the upper hand. As Ira Glasser, the legendary ex-head of the American Civil Liberties Union, says, speech restrictions are like poison gas. They may seem like a good idea when you have the enemy in your sights, but then the wind changes.
Well, on that note, Toby, we should wrap this up. But thank you very much for taking the time to speak to Always Take Notes, and good luck with your various projects going forward.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Hello, it's us again. Simon, what did you make of that interview? One of the first we did in lockdown, in fact.
Yeah, it was early in lockdown when we were still getting our heads around the technology, so not ideal sound quality. It was also before Toby Young had launched his latest venture, Lockdown Skeptics, which has been getting a lot of traffic recently, so we didn't really grill him about that. I thought it was interesting. We tried to get under the skin of what had been kind of motivating him in these various scrapes that he's gotten into over the years. I'm not sure we entirely managed that. What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, I think we could have done a better job at probing why he writes the things that he writes. I think we both found that it was quite difficult to interrupt him once he got going, but he did admit that he takes the path of most resistance because that's what he finds intellectually stimulating. So it's quite interesting to read his journalism in light of that. But whether we agree with what he writes or not, he's made a successful career from being a contrarian. So I think he was a good guest to have on the show.
Yeah, one I suppose wonders how much it's a choice and how much it's a kind of unconscious compulsion almost in terms of what the reason he ends up doing it. But anyway, an interesting episode. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Pegg.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer is Nicola Keane, our social media is by Katie Lee, our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Patreon at Always Take Notes, and if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.